Welcome to the TheMediaWard podcast. Vaccines have saved millions of lives. Through their continued use, humanity has rid itself of some truly devastating diseases and is well on its way to banishing more. But for as long as there have been vaccines, there have been those who are sceptical of vaccines, and that sentiment has never really subsided. In today's episode, we delve into the dual histories of vaccines and their detractors, separating fact from fiction and considering how we can move through the impasse of the current vaccine-critical discussion. Recent news stories of outbreaks of contagious diseases for which vaccines exist have fueled concerns about the apparent spread of science-illiterate parents who refuse to vaccinate their children. One can lament the degradation of centuries of work to eradicate deadly diseases and the increased risk of infection the rest of us now face, all because these irresponsible parents have decided that they know better than the medical professionals. That's one way to summarise the current state of vaccine skepticism. Here's another. Since the very first vaccines, there has been vaccine dissent. The themes that permeate the anti-vaccination arguments have remained consistent: tainted vaccine ingredients, medical and corporate greed, side effects, and the belief in sovereignty over one's own body. The first narrative, the kind you will readily find online or in the mainstream media, frames the anti-vaxxers as people who simply can't or won't see the truth about vaccines. Via this logic, the only way forward is education, or failing that, coercion. The second narrative offers a more open opportunity for discussion, an opportunity to understand vaccine dissenters' concerns, and maybe even find some common ground. The problem is that the first narrative has become the most socially acceptable one. If you dare to argue that beliefs surrounding vaccines are varied and valid, then you are likely to be lumped in with the anti-vaxxers and branded an idiot. That is problematic. Nothing should be above critical examination. No person, no institution, no concept. Nothing should be beyond scrutiny. Yet, the mainstream discourse would have you believe that vaccines should be above scrutiny, and that vaccine skepticism is entirely unfounded. Before we go any further, I feel the need to explain my personal viewpoint, mainly to lay to rest any flippant dismissals. At the time of producing this episode, the world is in the grip of COVID-19. The UK is a little over a year into a series of lockdowns. I've been lucky enough to be offered a vaccine, and by the time this episode is released, I will be fully vaccinated against COVID. I felt that the vanishingly small risk of serious side effects was well worth the benefits for both myself and the wider population. That sums up my view on vaccines in a nutshell. Right, back to the episode. It's estimated that vaccines save around 2 million lives every year. Vaccines are the only practical way that the world can move beyond COVID-19. Vaccines are safe. But they are still a medical intervention, and as such, they do carry risks. These risks are very small, but they do exist. Throughout their history, especially during times of pandemics, governments around the world have made policy decisions that either force citizens to undergo vaccination or at the very least make it impractical to avoid being vaccinated. These kind of mandates, whilst of no real concern to the majority of the populace, have generated pushback and defiance from those who would rather not be vaccinated themselves or have their children vaccinated. Vaccine skeptics are vilified and ridiculed by the media, governments and health services alike. Suggestions that vaccination policies could in any way reflect or be shaped in response to public concerns are dismissed or labelled as science denial. Whilst there does come a time where coercion is necessary for the greater good, the current black and white tone of the discussion may well be driving more opposition against vaccines. The forerunner to modern-day vaccines was a process called variolation. This procedure involved extracting a small amount of pus from a smallpox blister and then introducing it into a scratch on the recipient's arm. This generally led to a mild case of the disease, which granted immunity to future infections. It had a pretty significant mortality rate, but it was less than the mortality rate of acquiring the smallpox infection naturally. This process, which dates back to the 10th century, spread out from its origins in China and India towards the West. This practice was transformed into the first true vaccine in the late 1700s via the English physician Edward Jenner. Cowpox is a disease related to smallpox, but significantly less severe. Milkmaids would regularly catch the disease from the cows that they were milking, but after the disease had run its course, they would be immune to the much more severe smallpox. Edward Jenner wasn't the first to notice this, but he did test the theory and worked to make the procedure widespread. The new vaccines on offer were widely welcomed. Smallpox was a spectre of the time and had killed between 10 to 20% of the population. Although the vaccine was widely welcomed, it wasn't universally welcomed. For some people, especially parents, the thought of their child's arm being cut and the pus from a cowpox blister being inserted was an alarming prospect. Vaccines are commonplace now, but initially this notion was alien to a great many people. Medicine was significantly less advanced, and certainly less safe than it is now. The populace of Britain was also significantly more religious than today, an argument that the process of using animal-based diseases to immunize humans was seen by some as going against God and the natural order of things. There were other, scientifically based arguments against vaccination as well. There were many amongst the medical community who felt that a natural infection of smallpox would be preferable to an unnatural infection of cowpox. They feared that the immunity might not last, and that there might be side effects that had yet to be discovered. Others took a more philosophical stance against vaccination, taking issue with the violation of their personal liberty. These concerns deepened as England enacted mandatory vaccination in the mid-1800s. The concerns of the vaccine skeptics of 200 years ago are almost identical to the concerns of modern-day skeptics. Worries of bodily harm, ineffectiveness, and violation of personal liberty have persisted over the centuries. In the years following Britain's vaccine mandates, there were a number of protests, peaking with a 100,000-person strong march through Leicester, complete with banners, a child's coffin, and an effigy of Edward Jenner. Following public pressure, the Vaccination Bill of 1898 removed penalties for declining to be vaccinated, offering a conscientious objector clause, the first common use of that phrase. Around the same time, anti-vaccination groups were emerging in the States, citing many of the same concerns held by the English groups. These concerns grew stronger when, during times of smallpox outbreaks, a number of states implemented vaccine mandates, with fines for non-compliance. The mandates hit working-class vaccine dissenters harder than their middle-class counterparts. The working class could not afford to pay the fines, so the only real option was to submit to that which they didn't agree with. Whilst the smallpox vaccine was effective, although that was not so clear-cut at the time, even if the recipient had only mild side effects, they would end up missing a few days of work. Before any tangible worker protection laws, this absence would lead to lost income and the threat of losing one's job, a risk that couldn't be afforded by someone who was living pay packet to pay packet. The legal authority for the states to mandate vaccines came under scrutiny, and one legal challenge made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Following a smallpox outbreak in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the city government introduced a vaccine mandate, with a $5 fine for adults that refused to be vaccinated. That $5 is roughly equivalent to $150 in today's money. A Swedish Lutheran minister, Henning Jacobson, refused to be vaccinated and refused to pay the fine. He appealed his case, and it slowly worked its way up the legal chain, all the way to the Supreme Court. We've already spoken of the entanglement of vaccine mandates and class, that those who were wealthy enough to pay fines could opt out of being vaccinated, but for those less well off, they were in effect compelled to be vaccinated. But there was also a complicated relationship between vaccination policies and race in the United States, adding a further layer of complexity to the Supreme Court case. As is the case today, people of colour were overrepresented within the poor working classes. Due in no small part to xenophobia and racism, many of the vaccine mandates were enforced with threats of violence. There are a number of cases, especially in the South, of African Americans being vaccinated at gunpoint. When the bubonic plague began to spread throughout San Francisco, the Chinese immigrant population was blamed. The local health authority quarantined Chinatown and would only let people leave the area if they could prove that they had been vaccinated with a new treatment, the Hausman prophylactic. This new treatment was only about 50% effective and had some serious and common side effects, so the Chinese community was generally hesitant to submit to the procedure. Members of the Chinese community sued the local government in federal court, arguing that the specific targeting of their community with a vaccine mandate was a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The federal court agreed with them, setting a precedent that vaccination policy could not single out racial groups, but it didn't speak to the overall authority of government bodies to mandate vaccinations. This is where our Swedish minister, Jacobson, comes in. The Lutheran minister had been vaccinated as a child back in Sweden and had become very sick afterwards. After his travel to America, one of his sons was vaccinated and had also become sick. Jacobson considered the vaccine a threat to himself and his family, and given his personal experience, his viewpoint was understandable. Just the following year, the risks of these early vaccines, or more specifically, how they were produced, was made clear. Camden, New Jersey, had seen a serious epidemic of smallpox in their community, and in response, the local health officials mandated that all school children should be vaccinated before returning to school. Subsequently, children began to exhibit signs of tetanus, and 9 children died as a result. Upon investigation, it became clear that the vaccines had been contaminated during the manufacturing process. This led to reform in the regulation of pharmaceutical manufacturers, and the law that followed brought the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, into existence. With this incident in mind, Jacobson's reluctance to undergo vaccination was not unfounded. On the other hand, smallpox was a serious threat. 300 million people had been killed by it in the 20th century alone, and there were repeated flare-ups throughout the United States at the time. So, by the time the legal case made its way to the Supreme Court, the outcome was not clear-cut. The case held that the lower court had been correct in siding with the states. The full court opinion is 29 pages in length, but these few paragraphs effectively sum up the essence of the decision. The defendant insists that his liberty is invaded when the state subjects him to fine or imprisonment for neglecting or refusing to submit to vaccination, that a compulsory vaccination law is unreasonable, arbitrary, and oppressive, and therefore hostile to the inherent right of every free man to care for his own body and health in such way as to him seems best, and that the execution of such a law against one who objects to vaccination, no matter for what reason, is nothing short of an assault upon his person. But the liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States to every person within its jurisdiction does not import an absolute right in each person to be, at all times and in all circumstances, wholly freed from restraint. There are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. On any other basis, organised society could not exist with safety to its members. Even liberty itself, the greatest of all rights, is not unrestricted license to act according to one's own will. It is only freedom from restraint under conditions essential to the equal enjoyment of the same right by others. It was from this precedent that all subsequent American vaccine mandates have derived their legal backing. Now, it could be argued that whilst similar anti-vaccination arguments persist to this day, they are less convincing owing to the vastly improved nature of modern vaccines. Yet the improvements to vaccines don't really impact on arguments based upon the notions of liberty and freedom from class-based persecution. One of the most persistent and frequently cited allegations of vaccine harm is in relation to autism. This primarily began with a medical journal article published in 1998 that purported to have found evidence of a causal relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism. The study was authored by 12 British researchers and led by a physician named Andrew Wakefield. His research paper had followed the cases of 12 children, 8 of whom had showed symptoms of autism within days of receiving the MMR vaccine. The proposed mechanism for this rapid onset autism was that of disruption of the intestinal tissue due to persistent infection of the intestines caused by the vaccine. This persistent infection would lead to a form of bowel disease, which would in turn trigger autism. The MMR vaccine combined vaccines for mumps, measles, and rubella. During the press conference that coincided with the publication of the research paper, Andrew Wakefield was quoted as saying, "I can't support the continued use of these 3 vaccines given in combination until this issue has been resolved." While the text of the paper didn't claim to show a causal link, Wakefield did make that claim at the press conference. He recommended suspending the combined vaccine until further research can be conducted, in the meantime vaccinating for each disease individually. Following this negative publicity, the rates of MMR vaccination plummeted in the UK. So far, this all seems perfectly reasonable. Scary, especially for parents, but reasonable. A group of professionals had found a possible link between a combined vaccine and a serious side effect. All they were recommending was that people switch to the individual vaccines while further research was carried out, which seems perfectly prudent. Even if the concerns proved to be unfounded, it wouldn't do any harm to be cautious until more was known about the vaccine's effects. However, in this study, there was more going on than meets the eye. Ulterior motives, skewed data, and outright fraud. None of this was known initially, and the truth of the matter only came to light 6 years later. Let's start with the ulterior motives. Well, motive. As one might expect, that motive was financial gain. Wakefield had filed for a patent for a single antigen measles vaccine in 1997. If the UK's National Health Service made the switch to single antigen vaccines, there was a chance Wakefield could benefit from a substantial windfall. This didn't play out in his favour, as the NHS didn't make the switch, but it certainly was a conflict of interests. Further revelations brought to light some more details. While his patent didn't earn him any sizable sum, his work as an expert witness had netted him over £435,000. This income had been derived from British trial lawyers who were attempting to prove that the vaccine was dangerous. On top of this large sum, he had also received $55,000 from the Legal Aid Board, a fund to help people of lower income in matters of litigation. A number of the children that had been featured in the research paper were in fact litigants in cases against the vaccine manufacturers. Wakefield withheld this information from his 11 co-authors. As if this wasn't enough, evidence of data manipulation surfaced. The research paper claimed that 8 of the 12 children studied exhibited either gastrointestinal symptoms or symptoms of autism only days after being given the MMR vaccine. In actuality, only 2 of the 12 patients exhibited any symptoms. The paper also claimed that none of the 12 children had previously shown any signs of developmental delays, indicative of autism. It came to light that this was a falsehood. 2 of the children had in fact exhibited developmental delays prior to their vaccination. On top of this, further examination of the data revealed numerous inconsistencies. It had become clear that the data was fabricated. Combine the fabrication of the data with the financial conflict of interest that Wakefield had, and you have a fairly obvious conclusion. The study was designed to support unsubstantiated legal arguments, and if its conclusions were heeded, Wakefield stood to receive a sizable income. Following an investigation by the General Medical Council, he was struck off of the United Kingdom's medical register, effectively ending his career. The council stated that Wakefield had failed in his duties as a responsible consultant and had brought the medical profession into disrepute. Since the original journal article, the purported link between the MMR vaccine and autism has been studied extensively, and to date, not a single reputable study has confirmed Wakefield's findings. Since that time, the rate of autism diagnosis has continued to climb. For children born in 1992, about 1 in 150 would be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. For a child born in 2004, that rate is 1 in 69. On the face of it, that is a substantial increase, but making a fair comparison is not so simple. Our understanding of the autism spectrum has significantly improved, and many who would not have been classified as falling somewhere on the spectrum in the 90s would be more likely to be classified as being on the spectrum now. It is unclear whether the increasing rates of diagnosis reflected genuine increase in autism or simply greater awareness and improved diagnostics. The increasing diagnoses has continued to fuel concern among parents and drive research into any possible links. One such suggested link is that of thimerosal, a mercury-containing compound that was used widely as a vaccine preservative. Concerns were raised about mercury toxicity through the food chain and through vaccinations. Between 1999 and 2001, thimerosal was removed or drastically reduced in all childhood vaccines, except for some flu vaccines. This was a voluntary effort on the part of the vaccine manufacturers, and still, multiple subsequent studies have found no link between its use and autism. That being said, lowering the amount of mercury in vaccines is probably for the best. So the data is clear, vaccines do not cause autism, but there are some serious side effects that are well documented. Occasionally a child experiencing a fever will suffer from a seizure, known as a febrile seizure. Most of these febrile seizures last less than a minute or two and do not have any lasting effects, although they are of course deeply concerning for a parent. Around 1 in 20 children will have a febrile seizure at some point in their life, generally between the ages of 6 months and 5 years. Studies have shown that the MMR vaccine marginally increases the risk of febrile seizures during the 5 to 12 days after vaccination. There is a further small increase if the MMRV vaccine is used, which combines the mumps, measles and rubella components with a varicella chickenpox vaccine. A different CDC study looked into the combination of vaccinating against influenza on the same day as receiving either a DTaP or PCV13 vaccine. DTaP is a combined vaccine guarding against diphtheria, tetanus and whooping cough. PCV13 is a vaccine against pneumococcal bacteria, which can cause pneumonia, meningitis, and various other infections. The study showed that if the influenza shot was given on its own, there was no increased risk of febrile seizures. But if given on the same day as either of the other vaccines, there was an increased risk. This increase is small, at most 3 febrile seizures for every 10,000 children vaccinated, and as such, the CDC continues to recommend combining these vaccinations. Doing so is likely to cut down on doctor visits and the associated cost and time commitments. The raft of diseases that vaccines protect against can also themselves cause febrile seizures. So, by vaccinating against them, you are likely to be preventing the risk of future seizures, with a small risk of occasionally inducing them. There's more than one way to interpret this. You can view it as an acceptable risk of a serious but not life-threatening side effect, and as such, deem that the benefits of fewer doctor visits is worth it. Or you can see it as an unnecessary risk that you'd rather not take with your child. The first viewpoint is arguably the norm, and the latter the view of someone who could be described as vaccine hesitant. The issue is that second person, in some circles, will have those fears ridiculed, be dismissed as an anti-vaxxer, and may well then turn to anti-vaccination groups for further information. They could potentially follow that path all the way to the extreme end of the anti-vaxxer movement. On the other hand, if that person was able to openly discuss their concerns, learn the facts and come to their own conclusions, then the outcome could well be very different. Maybe that parent opts for separate vaccination visits. Maybe they skip these specific vaccines, or maybe they decide that the risk is worth it, and to proceed with a normal schedule. Now, of course, that is all hypothetical, but hopefully it's apparent that by allowing for more moderate positions, you might be able to avoid pushing people towards more extreme viewpoints. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Some of the research for this episode has come from the illuminating book Anti-Vax, Reframing the Vaccination Controversy by Bernice L. Hausman. This book delves into the world of vaccine skeptics, the beliefs they hold, and how those who are pro-vaccine might be able to reach some common ground with them. I don't necessarily agree with everything in the book, but it's an excellent book that does a terrific job at challenging your mentality and explaining the viewpoints of those with vastly different opinions to myself. It's also worth noting that, like this episode, it's not an anti-vaccine book. If you want to purchase a copy, might I suggest buying it from bookshop.org. Bookshop.org is an online bookstore that helps to support your local bookshops. They give away 75% of their profits to publishers, authors, and your corner bookstore. So if you're living in the United States or the United Kingdom, you can enjoy the convenience of ordering a book online while still supporting your all-important local booksellers. If you want to help out the podcast, you can purchase a copy of the book via my referral link, which you can find in the show notes, or go to bookshop.org/shop/TheMediaWard. Right, back to the show. The polio vaccine has had a bit of a troubled history. Following earlier incidents with tainted vaccinations, the requirements for safety testing had been made significantly stricter. Despite this, a batch of polio vaccines manufactured in 1955 was found to contain live polio virus as opposed to the intended dead virus. This contamination had been missed by the safety checks, and over 250 cases of polio were attributed to this faulty batch of vaccines, manufactured by Cutter Laboratories, based out of Berkeley, California. The tainted vaccine that was designed to protect people from the devastating effects of polio had instead infected them with it, leading to many cases of paralysis and other negative effects of the horrible disease. After this was discovered, more stringent controls were introduced into the vaccine manufacturing process, but unfortunately it was not the last case of tainted polio vaccines. Between 1955 and 1963, somewhere between 10 and 30% of polio vaccines administered in the US were contaminated with simian virus 40, SV40. This virus was introduced into the vaccine via the monkey kidney cell cultures that were used in the manufacturing process. There has been some concern that this could have led to increased cancer rates within the vaccinated individuals, although long-term monitoring of those affected has not seen any causal relationship. Further testing requirements were brought in following this incident to ensure this sort of thing couldn't happen again. Now, these incidents occurred about 60 years ago, but if you were around at the time, or worse still, were directly affected, it would be sure to leave a negative impression of vaccination. Testing and quality control has improved greatly, but for some, the concern about contamination of vaccines persist. The CDC currently recommend vaccinating to protect against 14 infectious diseases by the age of 2. The total number of separate injections is a little awkward to calculate due to variety in some of the combined vaccines and different requirements for booster jabs, but by age 2, a child can easily have had more than 30 separate injections. There are some who argue that this is simply too many, and that whilst any one vaccine by itself is not necessarily harmful, the sheer volume of vaccines might overload a child's system. As we've seen previously with the marginal increase in febrile seizure rates, administering certain combinations of vaccines can have unintended side effects. It is really only logical to wonder whether such a large volume and variety of vaccinations within the first 2 years of a child's life might in itself present some unnecessary risks. The data, however, would suggest otherwise. Aside from the minimal risk of seizures and fevers, there have been a number of studies that have indicated that there is no additional risk posed by the number of vaccines currently recommended by the CDC. As each new vaccine is licensed, it is tested both on its own and in concert with the other vaccines in the recommended schedule. Whilst the total number of vaccines given at such a young age might invite concern, it is precisely because of the age of the child that they are so necessary. Infants and young children are at a higher risk of death or serious complications if they contract one of the infectious diseases. While an infant will inherit a certain level of immunity to certain diseases from its mother, this immunity is fleeting. A baby's immune system will be exposed to thousands of germs and antigens in the environment in the natural course of growing up, and the vaccinations they are prescribed do not constitute a significant increase. Now, we've gone over a few concerns and heard a few examples of negative publicity, but how about some good solid numbers? We aren't going to go through the numbers for every single vaccine because we would be here all day. I've put some World Health Organization links on the website at TheMediaWard.co.uk if you wish to look at the adverse reaction rates for other vaccines. For now, we're going to focus on the combined mumps, measles and rubella vaccine, commonly known as the MMR vaccine. It's a common vaccine with an established track record, but also a history of controversy. As we've covered with the Wakefield scandal, there have been multiple studies that have dismissed any causal link between the vaccine and autism. But there are other side effects which do have a more credible link to the vaccine. Between 17 and 30% of patients will suffer from some kind of mild injection site reaction, soreness, inflammation, or redness. This can be uncomfortable, but it rarely lasts more than a day or two. Around 25% of people will experience some degree of cheek gland swelling, but once again this doesn't last long. Fevers, rashes and joint pain are experienced by between 1 to 5% of patients, but this is transitory. In around 10% of adult patients who receive the jab, symptoms of arthritis are experienced. This generally begins in the 1 to 3 week period after administering the vaccine and generally lasts 1 to 3 weeks. As mentioned previously, vaccines can induce a mild fever, which in turn can increase the risk of febrile seizures in children. The MMR vaccine increases the risk of these seizures approximately 1 extra seizure in 1 out of every 2,000 to 3,000 patients. Approximately 1 in 30,000 patients will see a drop in blood platelet levels, but this effect is generally transient and benign. In the modern version of the MMR vaccine, about 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million patients will go on to develop aseptic meningitis. Aseptic meningitis is a serious condition, but the vast majority of patients who seek medical treatment have the disease run its course in 1 to 2 weeks, and do not face ongoing health concerns. It should be noted that both mumps and measles themselves can cause aseptic meningitis, so in vaccinating against them you are protecting against it. Anaphylaxis, a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine, is encountered in between 1 in 285,000 and 1 in a million patients. Encephalopathy, swelling of the brain, occurs in around 1 patient for every million vaccines administered. There is not a proven causal link, but rather a probable causal link. In a natural measles viral infection, around 1 in 1,000 people suffer from a brain swelling, and around half of those are left with permanent central nervous system impairment. Research into the small number of cases of vaccine-induced brain swells appear to show that there is no increased risk of permanent nervous system damage. There have been case reports of severely immunocompromised patients, such as those suffering from HIV, dying following vaccinations. Due to these patients' greatly weakened immunity, the weakened virus material within some vaccines can replicate within their systems, leading to sickness and possible death. The incidents of this are vanishingly small enough to not be practically measurable, and poses more of a concern in developing countries where someone might not be aware that they are HIV positive before a vaccine is administered. This is all fairly representative. Minor side effects are not uncommon. Serious side effects are rare, are treatable, and fatal side effects are almost non-existent, and almost always involve complicating factors. For a lot of people, these figures, coupled with a general confidence in the scientific and medical communities, will be enough for them to vaccinate themselves and their children. For some people, that is not the case. Now, there is a stereotype of a science-illiterate, conspiracy theory-loving parent whose research into the topic of vaccines is limited to 20 minutes of scrolling through Facebook groups. Whilst this stereotype is not without basis, it would be unfair to assume that that is the only kind of person who might be vaccine hesitant, or even outright anti-vaccine. While these facts and figures might be reassuring to most, they don't persuade everybody. And there are perfectly valid viewpoints that lead some people to be anti-vaccine, even if they take on board the statistical low risk. One of the larger and more influential American anti-vaccine groups is the National Vaccine Information Center, commonly shortened to NVIC. If you trawl through their published literature, you will find a mix of reasonable philosophies, factually correct statements presented in a biased way, alongside outright false information. We have already focused on the facts surrounding vaccines and their risks, both real and perceived, so we are not going to examine the NVIC's take on that because at best their write-ups are misleading. What we are going to do is use them as a source for other types of concerns surrounding vaccines, concerns that do not revolve around the data and the risk-reward calculus of vaccines, but rather the more philosophical concerns. To quote the NVIC, many parents who support our work are not philosophically opposed to the concept of vaccination and do not object to every vaccine. However, they are philosophically opposed to government health officials having the power to intimidate, threaten, and coerce them into violating their deeply held conscientious beliefs in the event they conclude that either vaccination in general, or more commonly, a particular vaccine, is not appropriate for their children. Arguments based on personal liberty and the right to make choices regarding one's own body carry significant weight. These arguments are widely used in anti-vaccination groups, but that is not the only arena in which they are relied upon. The discussion around abortion rights, and more specifically the pro-choice side of the debate, rely on similar arguments of personal sovereignty, and that the choices that one makes regarding their own body are for that person alone to make. Another of the NVIC's arguments is based on a very narrow interpretation of the Hippocratic Oath, an ethical code historically used by physicians. Part of the oath focuses on the notion of doing no harm. The NVIC calls for an adoption of this principle within legislation regarding the medical industry, and specifically within legislation regarding vaccination. Vaccines would, by definition, fall foul of this requirement, as vaccines can and do cause harm. The common side effects are minor and the serious effects are rare, and many would argue that the benefits they impart massively outweigh the drawbacks, but they do cause harm. It's worth noting that if you were to restrict medical treatments to only those that do no harm, then you would have to jettison a huge portion of modern medicine. Chemotherapy involves deliberate introduction of poisons into a patient's system, which absolutely causes harm. That harm is accepted because it has been proven to be an effective treatment against cancer, and the benefits for many will outweigh the serious side effects. The NVIC also takes issue with the lack of legal liability that vaccine manufacturers face. In 1986, Congress passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which changed the legal liability that vaccine manufacturers were exposed to. Prior to the act, if you believed that a vaccine had caused harm, you could sue the manufacturer. Following the act, such legal action was severely restricted. In its place, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program was created. It operates as an alternative to legal liability by providing compensation in lieu of a legal settlement. It is funded by taxes levied upon vaccines. These funds are channeled into one big pot and then paid out when a vaccine injury occurs. Since its inception, it has paid out over $4 billion, which on the face of it seems to suggest a large number of vaccine injuries, but that's not quite the case. Since 2006, a little over 13,000 petitions have been raised. Of those cases, 7,662 cases resulted in a payout. Around 60% of these cases were settled, despite the CDC deeming them to not in fact be down to vaccine injury. As to why the fund would pay out for cases which are not due to vaccine injury, it comes down to the reality of the legal system. Whilst most cases that progress through the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program either end in a settlement or dismissal within the system, some do progress further and rely upon a court decision. There are situations where the fund would pay more out in legal fees than it would in simply settling a case, so it sometimes makes sense to settle a no-fault case. In the time period covered by those 7,662 successful cases, of which only around 3,000 are actually deemed to be related to vaccine injuries, over 3.7 billion vaccine doses have been distributed throughout the United States. Over 3.7 billion vaccine doses have been distributed throughout the United States. That works out to be one compensated vaccine injury case for every 483,000 vaccine doses administered, and only one genuine compensable injury in every 804,000 doses. The motivation behind shielding the companies from liability and creating a separate payout scheme was down to the rising cost of defending against litigation from vaccine injury claimants. How you interpret this really comes down to your worldview. Either the legal system allows for frivolous cases, which rack up huge legal fees, and the US government imbued a certain level of immunity upon vaccine manufacturers so that they would have a financial incentive to develop new and more advanced vaccines. Or vaccines have an inherent level of danger associated with them, and whilst this danger is small, because of the sheer volume of doses given, even low percentages will inevitably generate large enough pools of injured people, or rather people who feel they have been injured. As such, for the good of the population, there needs to be a more accessible method of recovering compensation. Or perhaps the juggernaut that is the pharmaceutical industry has enough sway with the government to have them provide a liability shield, so the pharmaceutical giants can continue to make massive profits without facing repercussions for their actions. Perhaps it's none of those, perhaps it's a little bit of everything, but there are a few contextual points that need to be raised. Vaccine manufacturers are not entirely void of legal culpability. If they neglect to provide accurate and appropriate instructions with their vaccines, they can be sued. If their product is deemed unsafe due to improper manufacturing, they can be sued. The only thing they can't be sued for is if a patient alleges injury because they are in the tiny minority of unlucky patients who experience a severe side effect. They can, however, petition the Vaccine Injury Compensation Fund. This comes with some benefits to the litigant, as it is significantly cheaper to petition the fund than to go through the court system. The NVIC raises the issue of underreporting. There have been a few studies which estimate that only about 1% of adverse vaccine events were actually reported to VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. These studies have been conducted by reputable institutions, such as the Harvard Pilgrim Health Center, the second largest health insurer in Massachusetts. The problem with that 1% figure is that it is lacking context. The 1% figure might be accurate for minor side effects, such as rashes or aching joints, but for serious side effects, the estimated reporting rates are significantly higher. Not every side effect is reported, and not every complaint after vaccination is caused by the vaccine. That raises a rather significant problem in researching the rarer side of effects of vaccines. Not every symptom following a vaccination is caused by the vaccine. People get sick, and with the sheer volume of vaccinations, there will be times when the two events coincide by chance. Many of the side effects can occur both from the disease the vaccine is immunizing you against, but can also occur naturally via many other sources. The long and the short of it is, even with robust statistical and normalizing methods, definitively linking an adverse event to a vaccine is not a simple thing to do. How widespread are anti-vaccination views? If the media is to be believed, it is sweeping through the Western world and the US is a hotbed. But how true is that? Different vaccines have different compliance rates, but we're going to continue to focus on the MMR vaccine as it's fairly representative. According to the World Health Organization, a vaccination rate of 95% is required to allow for robust herd immunity, that is, enough people being vaccinated to protect those who cannot be vaccinated. In the UK in 2009, uptake of the MMR vaccine at 2 years of age was around 89%. In 2013, it peaked at 93%, but as of 2019 that has dropped to 91%. In the States, in 2009, the rate was around 90%, peaked at 91.9% in 2015, and by 2017, the latest data available is at 91.5%. Those figures are lower than is ideal for herd immunity, and there is variation and a bit of a drop-off, but it's not the dramatic decline that you might assume is occurring. Nevertheless, a small but influential anti-vaccination movement can be the thin end of a wedge, and even if it isn't a widespread problem now, it could become one. The majority of public discussion surrounding vaccines, and specifically vaccine mandates, is dominated by talk of adverse side effects, both from the pro- and anti-vaccine sides of the debate. For parents concerned about the possibility of vaccine injury, vaccine mandates enforce medical treatment that they fear could cause their children harm. That fear is perceived by many a vaccine supporter to be a result of scientific illiteracy and a lack of understanding of the vast benefits of vaccination. Vaccine supporters, to counteract this, attempt to convey the risk-reward calculus and the notion of vaccination being both a personal benefit and a public good. This line of reasoning may persuade those who are simply hesitant to vaccinate and those who truly are not informed of the science, but such arguments may fail to convince a more steadfast vaccine skeptic. As we've seen, the anti-vax stance goes beyond scientific arguments and touches on wider philosophical and political themes, including bodily autonomy and the tension between individual liberty versus public good. The history of vaccination also has a complicated relationship with class, race and religion, and those who face discrimination on those bases may have understandable reasons to be vaccine hesitant. There are a number of verified accounts of corruption and shady dealings throughout the history of the pharmaceutical industry. Fraud, bribery, price gouging. Governments have no better track record, so when the government mandates vaccinations, those who are sceptical of the motives of Big Pharma and the authorities will understandably be concerned. With that said, vaccination is of vital importance to humanity as a whole. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown this with a great deal of clarity. Anti-vaccination sentiments can absolutely be a threat to the population, especially those who, for medical reasons, cannot be vaccinated. Vaccination is absolutely a necessity, but as with a great many things discussed in the mainstream media and modern political circles, the nuance and complexity of the situation have been stripped away, leaving only the polarized extremes. If you like the podcast, you might like my YouTube channel. Find it at youtube.com/TheMediaWard. If you want to support the podcast, please rate it, subscribe, or share it with a friend. It all helps more than you might imagine. If you want to be even more amazing, perhaps you might consider supporting me on Patreon. There you'll find ad-free episodes, get access to the episodes 2 weeks early, meaning the next episode is already available for patrons, and on top of that, one extra episode every season. You'll also get access to behind-the-scenes content for the YouTube channel, such as extended cuts and bloopers. You can find me at patreon.com/TheMediaWard. I'd like to thank St. Valentine Music for providing all of the music you've heard in today's episode. For a full list of my sources, please visit the website at themediaward.co.uk. And one last thing. Interestingly, the cow-based origin of the modern vaccine concept is reflected in its name. The Latin word for cow is vacca, V-A-C-C-A, which was adopted into the name for the original cowpox/smallpox vaccine. Initially, the name was limited to the use of the cow-derived vaccine, but later spread to encompass vaccines as a whole.